Glad to see you back in our channel. I am going to read to you Flat Stanley today. Do you remember Flat Stanley? I hope you do. Remember we talked about Flat Stanley in math because we were learning about 3D shapes and two-dimensional shapes, and we talked about how Flat Stanley, he was flat as a piece of paper. And so he was very thin on one end. So you're going to listen to the story about Flat Stanley and his feelings, and you're going to meet his family. And I want you to pay attention to the story so you can tell someone what the story of Flat Stanley is. And you can explain to them. I want you to tell them Flat Stanley is a 3D or 2D shape. What do you think? You're right. He's a two-dimensional shape because he's flat like a paper and he's not 3D like a ball. Flat Stanley goes camping. What do you see on the cover of the book? I see Flat Stanley standing by the fire. I see the moon behind Flat Stanley, and it's nighttime. What else do you see? Flat Stanley goes camping. This story was created by Jeff Brown, by Laurie Hanskins, and the pictures were illustrated by Mackie Pennington. Stanley Lamchop lived with his mother, his father, and his little brother Arthur. Stanley was 4 feet tall, about a foot wide, and a half an inch thick. He had been flat ever since a bulletin board fell on him. I see Flat Stanley and his family that they're walking somewhere. Where do you think they're going? What is your prediction based on what you see on the picture? Let's find out if your prediction is correct. There were lots of good things about being flat. Stanley could put on sunscreen on one swipe. As you can see, his brother has to have mom put the sunscreen because it takes him longer. Stanley had the best back float at the pool. If your prediction was that they were going to go to the pool, you're right. Excellent prediction. Stanley had the loudest belly flop too, but sometimes it was hard being the only flat kid in town. I think Flat Stanley was feeling kind of sad when he saw another boy laughing at him for being flat. He was feeling sad. I'm sick of being flat, said Stanley one morning. Flat is lame. Lame, said Mrs. Lambshop. Why, some of the best things in the world are flat. Like the newspaper, said Mr. Lambshop. And fried eggs and pancakes and bacon, said Arthur. I guess so, said Stanley. After breakfast, Mr. Lambshop started loading up the car with tents and sleeping bags. What's going on? Asked Arthur. We're going camping, said Mrs. Lambshop. This family needs some fresh air. All right, yelled Arthur. Stanley barely smiled. After a short drive, the Lambshops arrived at the Roaring River campground. Stanley was helpful as usual. He helped carry the firewood. Because he's flat, he's able to carry lots of firewood. Stanley blocked the wind so his mother could start a fire. But Stanley wasn't himself. He wouldn't even eat any s'mores. Too flat, he muttered. Why don't you two go exploring? Suggested Mr. Lambshop. Good idea, said Mrs. Lambshop. Just don't get lost, or fall off a cliff, or touch any poison ivy. Have fun, dears. Stanley and Arthur set out. Hey, animal tracks, sir. Animal tracks, said Arthur. Let's follow them. The boys followed the tracks along the river, through some trees, and up a steep hill with a cliff on one side. The tracks ended here, said Arthur. He peered over the cliff. I wonder what kind of animal made them. Arthur, said Stanley. Arthur turned around. Skunk, he whispered. Let's get out of here. But the boys were trapped. The skunk was on one side, the cliff was on the other. Then the skunk raised its tail. What do we do? Arthur wailed. Mom said not to fall off a cliff, said Stanley. She didn't say not to jump off. What do you think they're going to do? What's your prediction? Let's find out. Suddenly, Stanley grabbed Arthur by both hands and jumped. Ah! Arthur screamed. Then Arthur opened his eyes. He wasn't falling. He was sailing. Above him, Stanley's body made the perfect parachute. The boys landed with a gentle blop. That was awesome, said Arthur. Thanks, said Stanley. Now, where are we? Arthur and Stanley looked around. All they saw were trees. We are lost, said Arthur, and it's getting dark. Then Stanley spotted something. That's the river, he said. Our campground is on the river. The boys ran to the water's edge, about a mile downstream, were the two cozy lamb chop tents. What can we do? It will be dark before we can walk that far, said Arthur. I know, said Stanley. Stanley got a running start and belly flopped into the river. Splash! Then he flipped over onto his back. Climb on! Woohoo! Cried Arthur. I always wanted to go rafting. Arthur and Stanley made it back to camp. Drippy, but safe. Let's keep this to ourselves, said Stanley. I can't believe we got lost and went off a cliff, Arthur said. At least we didn't touch poison ivy. Hey there, said Mrs. Lambshop. Just in time for supper. That night, Arthur whispered to Stanley from his sleeping bag, "You know, if you weren't flat, you couldn't have saved us today." Stanley smiled. "Maybe being flat isn't so lame," he said. And the next day, Stanley found out another good thing about being flat. He could put on poison ivy cream on one swipe. The end. I hope you liked this story as much as I did. I hope to see you on the next one. And don't forget to look at Miss T's videos too and Miss Lara's videos. They have different books and they have different things to for you to see. So we'll see you on the next one.